George Santayana once said, quote, "A country without a memory is a country of madmen," meaning that a collective national memory, how its own history is perceived, is key and vital in maintaining social and political cohesion. Recognizing this, it's not unusual to see national narratives being produced which guide and shape the interpretation of past events in order to help set goals and guide overall policy in the present. And the perfect example of this can be seen in the People's Republic of China. I'm your host David, and for this episode, we are going to look at the role the Century of Humiliation has played in shaping the PRC through the Cold War and into the present day. This is the Cold War. Anyone today who reads Chinese newspapers or hears official statements will eventually encounter the Century of Humiliation. It's a tale of loss and foreign subjugation, and has molded the China we see today. During the Century of Humiliation, China suffered the loss of territory, loss of control over her internal and external environment, and loss of international standing and dignity. It's become the PRC's founding narrative, akin to the United States' independence from Britain during their Revolutionary War. It remains to this day a narrative employed by the PRC to show to the world that China was once bullied, but will never be again. Direct trade between Europe and China began in 1557 when the Portuguese leased an outpost from the Qing Dynasty at the port of Macau. This port was quickly connected to other trade networks, and after the Spanish conquest of the Philippines, silver started to pour into China from South American mines. China soon established a trade policy accepting only silver bullion for her prized goods such as silk, porcelain, and tea. British ships began to appear sporadically in the 17th century, but soon Britain's economy and population became dependent on Chinese tea. The Canton system emerged in 1757 under the Qing Dynasty, designed to control trade with the West, confining it to the port of Guangzhou. In 1793, the British defeated the Mughal Empire and acquired a monopoly for the British East India Company over its opium. Meanwhile, a silver trade deficit emerged between China and Britain. This deficit, alongside the cost of the Napoleonic Wars and American Revolution, had drained Britain of silver. Without silver to trade for tea, the British East India Company turned to trading something else that it now had in relative abundance: opium. Opium, though, had been continuously banned in China, thus to get away with this, the British East India Company used private British and Indian merchants to smuggle the forbidden substance. An illicit trade emerged between the British East India Company and the Chinese merchants permitted to trade with Westerners in Guangzhou, known as the Kohong merchants. Now, the late Qing Dynasty was rampant with corruption. Qing officials embezzled, bribed, misappropriated, and fleeced the population. Because the Kohong merchants held a monopoly on foreign trade, the Qing officials appointing them extorted them in a patron-like system. Because of this, the Kohong merchants began to smuggle opium into China to make ends meet. Likewise, the Qing government became increasingly dependent on the tax revenue acquired from the illicit trade. The trade soon drained China of her silver as opium addiction spread and tore the social fabric of China apart. By 1839, the Daoguang Emperor, after countless attempts to stop the opium trade, appointed Viceroy Lin Zezhu to go to Guangzhou to put an end to it. The incorruptible Lin Zezhu demanded the foreigners hand over the opium. The British Superintendent of Trade in China, Charles Elliot, convinced them to do so under the promise that Britain would compensate them for the loss. Lin Zezhu confiscated 2,283 chests of opium and publicly destroyed them on Humen Beach. The Qing then shut down trade, and because of Charles Elliot's false promise, Britain chose to go to war to force the Qing to meet their demands. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 saw Britain defeat the Qing Dynasty and force them to sign the humiliatingly unequal Treaty of Nanking, the first of many more to come. The Qing government had to pay the British war reparations, the cost of the confiscated opium, open 5 treaty ports, and cede Hong Kong Island. Yet the status of the opium trade remained unresolved, and the illicit trade increased. Thus began the Century of Humiliation. From then on, Britain and other nations forced unequal treaties with China, giving them favored nation status, extraterritoriality, and fixed trade tariffs. Opium ravaged China, people stopped working, the military became less effective, the economy declined. The British, joined by France, initiated a second Opium War in 1856, forcing the Qing Dynasty to sign the Treaty of Tianjin, and as a further punishment, looted and burnt down the Summer Palace. More ports were forced open, Kowloon was ceded to Britain, indemnities were paid, and opium was legalized in China. Like sharks smelling blood, other nations began enacting their own unequal treaties with China, containing one-sided terms which forced China to open treaty ports, give up tariff autonomy, cede further land, and grant extraterritorial privileges. The people of China began to rebel against what they saw as a corrupt and feeble government that could do nothing to stop foreign encroachment. The Taiping Rebellion nearly toppled the Qing Dynasty, seeing 20 to 30 million people killed, the bloodiest civil war in history so far. Upon taking power in 1949, the Communist Party of China, the CPC, formed a narrative portraying themselves as the only modern Chinese political party able to successfully stand up to foreign aggression. Politburo member Liu Yunshan stated in 2009, quote, "The establishment of a new China put an end to the situation in which the old China was split up, the nation was subject to humiliation, and the people experienced untold sufferings." The CPC continues to wield the Century of Humiliation narrative that the West has not fundamentally changed. In the words of Hu Jintao, Western hostile forces have not yet given up the wild ambition of trying to subjugate us. After the US accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, Han Zhongkun wrote in the People's Daily, "This is 1999, not 1899. This is not the age when the Western powers plundered the Chinese Imperial Palace at will, destroyed the old Summer Palace, and seized Hong Kong and Macau. China is a China that has stood up. It is a China that has defeated the Japanese fascists. It is a China that had a trial of strength and victory over the United States on the Korean battleground. The Chinese people are not to be bullied." The opium epidemic, governmental corruption, and foreign subjugation encompassed all the things that went wrong for China during the Opium Wars. The Century of Humiliation would be wielded as a narrative by the PRC post-1949, lessons learned, things that needed to be remedied. Till the 1950s, opium had become a local and provincial source of revenue. The opium trade flourished under nationalist China, and during the 1940s, the CPC's Shangang-Ning border region cultivated and sold it to both Japanese-occupied and Kuomintang provinces. During the Cold War, Mao Zedong faced multiple challenges, one of the greatest of which was to finally end the disease of opium. In the 1950s, Mao Zedong forced tens of millions into compulsory treatment, executed dealers, and forced opium-producing regions to plant other crops. Gradually, opium production was pushed into the Golden Triangle, primarily serving Southeast Asia. Mao Zedong utilized unrestrained repression to stamp opium out, and by 2003, China estimated that there were only 4 million regular users and only 1 million registered drug addicts that remained. Author Richard Harris wrote for International Affairs in 1959, arguing the PRC thought of their history in terms of up to the Opium Wars and after the Opium Wars. It became the founding moment for modern China, a source of lessons about the nature of national power and the modern international system. The Opium Wars drive prominent Chinese figures to ask why were Western nations strong and China was weak? How might China improve? While the Western nations certainly used their technological might to subjugate them, it was also true China had become stagnant, ineffective, and suffered from rampant corruption. The CPC argued that it was widespread corruption that had led to the downfall of the KMT. Despite having superior numbers and better equipment, rampant corruption damaged the KMT's popularity with the people and helped the CPC's propaganda war. However, when the CPC came into power, corruption remained rampant, seen particularly in the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. The emergence of a private sector within the state economy, post-Mao, saw numerous CPC members misuse their authority to enrich themselves. Xi Jinping proclaimed endemic corruption in the CPC as his signature issue for his first years in office. In 2012, Xi Jinping initiated the largest anti-corruption campaign in the history of the PRC, targeting both tigers, the elites, and flies, the lower-level cadres. As of 2003, 2.3 million government officials have been prosecuted. During and after the Opium Wars came what American sinologist John F. Fairbank called the Treaty Century. China was forced to pay large amounts of indemnities, open ports for trade, and cede or lease territories. The Convention of Peking ceded Kowloon to Britain, and the Treaty of Aigun ceded Outer Manchuria to Russia. After this came a plethora of concessions given to the leading global powers. France received Guangzhou and Samian Island, Germany got Jiaozhou Bay, and Britain received the new territories, thereby consolidating all of Hong Kong. Taking further advantage of the weak dynasty, France invaded Indochina, commencing the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. China by this point had made efforts to modernize, but nonetheless lost this undeclared war against France. China ceded her suzerainty over Vietnam, which soon became a French protectorate. On the heels of this loss, the British conducted the Sikkim expedition in 1888, defeating the Qing Dynasty and forcing them to sign the Convention of Calcutta, recognizing a British protectorate over Sikkim. Yet, of all the foreign powers to invade China, none would cause more harm than the Empire of Japan. China and Japan had been in conflict for decades for influence over Korea's Joseon dynasty. Despite China losing multiple wars against foreign nations and being forced to quell multiple rebellions, the idea that little brother Japan could defeat big brother China seemed ridiculous to the Qing court. Historically, Japan was strongly influenced by China, owing its writing system, architecture, culture, religion, philosophy, and law to Big Brother. However, when both China and Japan were forcibly opened up to the world in the mid-19th century, they took dramatically different paths. Japan underwent the Meiji Restoration, a hyper-modernization where she adopted the very best aspects of foreign powers while retaining specific aspects of Japanese culture. Japan was successful at thwarting colonization and dramatically improved her military capabilities. Meanwhile, China was invaded, forced to sign unequal treaties, forced to pay war indemnity payments, continued to suffer internal strife, and continued rampant corruption, and had a lackluster modernization process. The two empires went to war in 1894, and China lost as a result of her own corruption and Japan's modernized military prowess. The Qing dynasty had heavily invested in a navy with modern ships, but massive corruption within her institutions undermined the Beiyang fleet. Corrupt military commanders siphoned funds by halving ship crews and military units while still reporting full rosters. Commanders received appointments based on loyalties rather than qualifications. For example, Admiral of the Beiyang fleet Ding Wuchang had previously been a cavalry commander with no real knowledge of naval affairs. Regional competition led the Nanyang, Fujian, and Guangdong fleets to simply let the Beiyang fleet face the Imperial Japanese Navy alone in order to save their own warships and further funding. Most famously, the Beiyang fleet suffered from a crippling shortage of ammunition as Qing officials in charge of ordnance departments were cutting products and purchasing old gunpowder from the black market in order to increase profits. It was a watershed moment for China. Her institutional corruption had cost her a war against a nation she historically considered subordinate to her. While she had lost multiple wars to European powers, to be defeated at the hands of a fellow Asian power was an enormous loss of face. Japan overtook China as the regional power as a result. In other words, little brother had become big brother. China lost Taiwan, the Pescadores, and was forced to lease the Liaodong Peninsula as well as cede her sphere of influence over Korea to Japan. This event created two long-lasting wounds, both of which would plague the PRC, an antagonistic relationship with Japan, and the loss of Taiwan. In the wake of the Second World War, the PRC was initially hostile to Japan, but relations gradually normalized. The PRC's main concerns were the potential for Japan's remilitarization, as well as Japanese efforts against the One China policy. Henceforth, during times when Japan adhered to the One China policy, Sino-Japanese relations went well, but when Japan didn't, relations suffered. Trade actually flourished until the mid-1950s, when Japan recognized Taipei as the sole legitimate Chinese government. The PRC suspended trade in 1958 and requested Japan not join any conspiracy to create two Chinas. After the Sino-Soviet break, the PRC, out of the economic necessity, revived trade with Japan. After the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, held in 1978, Deng Xiaoping put forward the concept of, quote, one country, two systems, for resolving the issues of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. Relations between Beijing and Tokyo have deteriorated since 2005, however, when Japan and the US issued a joint statement addressing issues concerning the Taiwan Strait. In 2010, China overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy, and this in many ways has been perceived as China reclaiming her role as Big Brother. The Japan-Taiwan official split is still a fundamental part of Sino-Japanese relations today. The First Sino-Japanese War unleashed a wave of foreign encroachment upon China known as the Scramble for Concessions. In 1897, Kaiser Wilhelm II declared his intent to seize territory in China, sparking other global powers such as Britain, France, Russia, and Japan to seize their own parts of China. Germany took control over mines, railways, and developmental loans in Shandong province. Russia gradually seized influence over all the territory north of the Great Wall, with tax exemption in Xinjiang and Mongolia. France seized influence over Yunnan and over most of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces. Britain seized influence over the entire Yangtze River Valley, alongside parts of Tibet, Guangxi, and Guangdong, and Japan seized influence over Fujian province. Now, alongside this unprecedented carving up of China came the presence of Christian missionaries, who got involved in internal disputes. China was struggling with banditry, while foreign missionaries began offering protection to anyone who converted to Christianity, so the bandits abused this. This led to the formation of the Big Sword Society, whose initial purpose was to fight banditry, but soon began to fight Christians who they deemed to be harming China. Then in Shandong, a new group arose known as the Yihequan, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known to the West as the Boxers. These were young males who took up martial arts and practiced a type of spiritual possession, performing incantations that they believed made them invulnerable to blows or bullets. Although the Boxers initially rose up to defend local communities from bandits, they soon turned against the Christian missionaries and their converts. The Boxer movement grew exponentially and began demanding that foreign powers cease their imperialistic activities. The Qing government was between a rock and a hard place. They sought to appease the Western powers in order to thwart any further subjugation, but were losing face in the process. They initially suppressed the Boxers, but gradually some Qing officials saw them as a means to fight off foreign powers. The corrupt Manchu leaders, such as the Empress Dowager Cixi, simply sought to retain their authority over the throne and gradually came to believe the Boxers might turn the tide in opposing foreign encroachment. The foreign legations in Peking were besieged by Boxers working with Qing forces. In response, a grand 8-nation alliance was formed to rescue the legation. British, French, German, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, American, Russian, and Japanese forces joined together to march on Peking. After a 55-day siege, the 8-nation alliance defeated the Qing and Boxer forces, rescued the foreign legation, and proceeded to sack the capital. To end the war, the Qing government was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol on September 7, 1901. The Qing Dynasty had to pay 450 million taels of silver to the 8 nations over the course of 39 years. It was more than the Qing government's annual tax revenue, a colossal sum. The outcome of the Boxer Rebellion further eroded faith in the Qing government and fostered revolutionary fever. The people of China saw their government as decrepit, corrupt, and unable to defend them against foreign imperialism. It was within this time period that Dr. Sun Yat-sen established his anti-Qing alliance, the Tongmenghui, which later became the Kuomintang. Henceforth, Dr. Sun Yat-sen would dedicate his life to overthrowing the Qing dynasty and ushering in a republic. The Boxer movement was both praised and condemned by prominent future figures in the PRC. Some drew parallels to the Cultural Revolution, as both events had noble goals to eliminate things hurting the nation, but the means chosen to do so were extreme and violent. During the Boxer Rebellion, the Yihequan used violence to try and eliminate foreign encroachers and their Christian converts. Likewise, during the Cultural Revolution, the radical youths, known as Red Guards, were encouraged to rid China's cities of class enemies, eliminate Western ties, and destroy outdated traditions. The PRC erased a lot of Chinese history as Mao's Little Red Book replaced older texts. Mao Zedong urged the populace to rise up against capitalist roaders, those who followed the capitalist road. He also urged the peasantry to use violence against rural landed gentry and to tear down China's traditional culture. Such was the Cultural Revolution. the Boxers brought unspeakable suffering and humiliation to the people of China, and the same can be said of the Cultural Revolution. In 2021, Xi Jinping commemorated the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC with a speech recasting the past centuries of Chinese history. Xi retold the histories of the Taiping and Boxer rebellions and how they transformed into patriotic movements by the Chinese people to resist foreign encroachment. Xi Jinping warned that China will not be bullied, oppressed, or subjugated. Anyone who dares to try will find their heads bashed bloody against a great well of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. Such fiery speeches showcase how the PRC continues to use the humiliation narrative as it takes its place as a global power. Xi Jinping characterizes events such as the Boxer Rebellion as watershed moments, China attempting to improve her condition, to modernize, but ultimately failing. The Century of Humiliation saw the fall of China as the economic and political superpower of Asia, and even arguably the world, to become the sick man of Asia. Xi Jinping noted in recent years that while China was exploited by foreign powers, it was mostly the result of corruption, internal weakness, and an overall backwardness. Xi also described China from the 19th to early 20th century as a semi-feudal state. Furthermore, he argued the CPC broke China out of backwardness and finally earned the support of the Chinese people because the party had demonstrated effectiveness. Xi Jinping hails the CPC's century-long efforts to revive the Chinese people, continuously drawing upon 5,000 years of Chinese history and civilization. Now, during the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxers had attacked the Chinese Eastern Railway, prompting Russia to invade Manchuria. 100,000 Russians came to protect the railway and relieve a siege of Harbin. The Russians soon captured the 3 provinces of Manchuria and occupied and fortified major cities such as Mukden. Alongside the invasion came a series of pogroms, ethnic killings and reprisals against Manchu, Han, Daur, and other peoples. The most egregious killings took place in the 64 villages on the northern bank of the Amur River, Heilongjiang and at Blagoveshchensk. Thousands of civilians were drowned in the Amur River or shot by Russian forces. Japan and the other 6 members of the 8-nation alliance were very wary of Russia's actions and called upon Russia to withdraw. Russia gave assurances she would after quelling the Boxer Rebellion. In April of 1902, Russia agreed to a 3-stage withdrawal of her Manchurian forces to occur by the end of 1903. But instead of pulling out, on May 15, 1903, Tsar Nicholas ordered the exclusion of foreign influence from Manchuria and deployed even more forces along the Manchuria-Korean border. Japan viewed all of these actions as provocative and strategically threatening. This led Japan and Britain to sign the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902 as a means to thwart further Russian encroachment. Russia still refused to withdraw her forces, and this galvanized the Japanese into action. On June 23rd, Emperor Meiji agreed that, if necessary, Japan would go to war with Russia. In a last-ditch effort, on August 3rd, 1903, Japan offered to cede her interests in Manchuria if Russia would cede her interest over Korea to Japan. On October 3rd, the Russians sent a counter-proposal. Japan would cede Manchuria to Russia, both would mutually respect the territorial integrity of Korea, recognize Russian special interests in Korea, and make the 39th parallel a neutral buffer zone. The counter-proposal was a slap in the face. The 2 empires went to war, fighting numerous land battles within Manchuria. For China, it was a humiliating situation, having foreign empires fighting one another over her soil, completely disregarding her own sovereignty. China declared neutrality from the outset of the war, warning both nations not to violate her territory, but neither paid any attention. During the war, both the Russians and Japanese mistreated the Manchurian population. Towns and villages were looted and burned, women were raped, and numerous civilians were killed. It's estimated that China suffered 20,000 civilian deaths and over 69 million taels worth of silver in property damages. Japan shocked the world, defeating the Russians. Now, as much as the war humiliated China, it did have a profound effect on the Chinese nationalist movement and galvanized anti-imperialist thinking. Dr. Sun Yat-sen said of its effect, "Since the rise of the Japanese, the Caucasians dare not look down on other Asiatic peoples. Thus, the power of Japan not only enables the Japanese to enjoy the privileges of a first-class nation, but enhances the international position of other Asiatic peoples." It was the first time in history a non-white nation had defeated a white nation, let alone a superpower. For many across the globe, the victory demonstrated that European superiority was a myth. Prominent figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Mustafa Kemal, Abdulhamid II, and Mao Zedong saw it as a turning point in global history. Now, a large reason the war occurred was because Kaiser William II continuously pushed Tsar Nicholas II by using the Yellow Peril as a threat. The Yellow Peril, or Le Péril jaune, was a racist concept that gained prominence in the late 19th century, predicting the people of Asia would unite and become an existential threat to the Western world. The Kaiser notoriously used the Yellow Peril to encourage European empires to invade and colonize China. In the famous Willie Nicky correspondence, the Kaiser sent numerous letters to the Tsar proclaiming he had been chosen by God to protect the West from the Yellow Hordes. In one such letter, quote, 20 to 30 million Chinese, supported by half-dozen Japanese divisions, led by competent, intrepid Japanese officers, full of hatred for Christianity. That is a vision of the future that cannot be contemplated without concern, and it is not impossible. On the contrary, it is the realization of the Yellow Peril, which I described a few years ago, and I was ridiculed by the majority of people for my graphic depiction of it. Your devoted friend and cousin, Willie, Admiral of the Atlantic. The Yellow Peril changed over time. In the 1870s, it was directed primarily against Chinese workers in North America, striking fear that North Americans would lose their livelihood to Asian immigrants, prompting the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. During the 1890s, the Yellow Peril was used primarily against the Chinese, particularly during the Boxer Rebellion. The Kaiser made numerous speeches promoting the threat posed by the Yellow Peril in the form of China, but after the Boxer Rebellion, the Kaiser began applying it to Japan instead. During China's warlord period, the Yellow Peril was used against certain cliques to promote others. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, a Methodist convert, gradually became the perceived Christian Chinese savior of China. During the Second World War, the Yellow Peril was notoriously used against the Japanese, as frequently seen in Allied propaganda depicting Japanese as subhuman, apes, rats, and rapists. During the Chinese Civil War, the Yellow Peril was applied again to the Chinese forces of Mao Zedong. During the Cold War, the Yellow Peril was famously applied in the fictional world, embodied in figures such as the evil Dr. Fu Manchu. Dr. Fu Manchu led a pan-Asian criminal organization bent on conquering the world, but was continuously foiled by British policeman Sir Dennis Nayland Smith and his companion Dr. Petrie. Other elements of the Yellow Peril would be used in Western media throughout the Cold War years, such as the seductress stereotype of the Dragon Lady or the Mongolian horde that would overrun the Western world, applied to both Communist China and Russia and the Soviet Union. In 1991, Wang Lixiang wrote Yellow Peril, a prophecy fiction about a civil war within the PRC that turns into a nuclear exchange that soon throws the world into World War III. Wang Lixiang, an outspoken democracy activist, wrote this following the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. Today, elements of the Yellow Peril can still be found and is often applied or alluded to as part of accusations that the PRC is scheming to undermine the integrity of elections in nations like Canada, whether true or not. The Yellow Peril's history has been an enduring racist narrative faced by China, bred from the Century of Humiliation. After the Russo-Japanese War, Dr. Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionary figures participated in multiple uprisings until 1911, when the Xinhai Revolution successfully overthrew the Qing Dynasty, ushering in the Republic of China. It was the culmination of decades of dissatisfaction with the Qing government, and it ended 2,132 years of imperial rule in China. Although Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the leading figure of the movement and was elected president of the new republic, the leader of the Beiyang army, Yuan Shikai, managed to steal the presidency for himself. Yuan Shikai led the Qing forces against the revolutionaries, but in truth was secretly negotiating with the rebels to earn the best position possible in the new republic. Yuan Shikai secured the abdication of the Qing emperor and in return demanded the presidency, which the revolutionaries agreed to as Yuan Shikai's Beihai army was simply too powerful. As president, Yuan Shikai violently suppressed the Kuomintang and other revolutionary forces before establishing a dictatorship. Yuan Shikai then went a step further, proclaiming himself emperor over a new Qing Dynasty that would last only 83 days as it alienated everyone against him. To complicate matters further, the First World War broke out. With the European powers preoccupied, the Empire of Japan took advantage of the situation. Japan joined the Entente, seeking to claim German possessions in Asia and the Pacific, including the Marshalls, Carolines, Marianas, and the port city of Tsingtao. China declared neutrality in the war as she was facing financial chaos, political instability, and was militarily weak. When Japan laid siege to Tsingtao, Yuan Shikai protested the infringement on China's sovereignty, but just like with the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese didn't care. There was nothing Yuan Shikai's government could do, as none of the other great powers were going to help if Japan invaded. After seizing Tsingtao, Japan issued the infamous 21 demands. Japan demanded control over former German concessions, a 99-year lease extension for the South Manchuria Railway Zone, extraterritoriality in southern Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia, concessions over steel factories, mines, railways, and, most egregious, for China to hire Japanese advisors who would take effective control over China's finance and security. In essence, Japan wanted to make China a protectorate. The Japanese sought to make the terms of the demand secret, not wanting to ruffle the feathers of external powers nor the Chinese people. Yuan Shikai stalled and negotiated as much as his government could, but he also leaked the demands to the foreign powers, and their media press leaked it to the Chinese people. They were outraged not only by the Japanese demands, but by the feeble response from the Beiyang government. The 21 demands, as a result, became the 13 demands, as the Japanese got rid of the most egregious demands, and Yuan Shikai reluctantly signed them. This situation established what colloquially became known as the Shandong problem, as the status of the former German lease, Jiaozhou Bay, became known. In an effort to bolster China's claims to Jiaozhou Bay, as well as other concessions in Shandong, the Beiyang government sent hundreds of thousands of laborers to Europe to help Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States in the Entente war effort. Though China was forbidden to send combat units, Chinese laborers came at a critical time in the war to aid the Entente. These non-combatants would repair tanks, assemble shells, transport supplies, including ammunition, and dig trenches, amongst many other tasks. Hundreds of Chinese students served as translators. The Chinese government saw the overseas work as an enormous opportunity for Chinese youth to learn new technical skills and ingenuity which could be brought back to the homeland. There was enormous hope that through this action, China would earn seats at the Paris Peace Conference to help undo some of the unequal treaties subjugating China. After suffering losses from unrestricted German U-boat warfare, China also declared war on the Central Powers on August 14, 1917, likewise hoping to improve her standing at the peace talks. China earned 2 seats at Versailles, but would be humiliated and shocked by the responses to their demands. The Chinese delegates came to the talks knowing about the 13 demands that they argued were signed under duress. However, they were not aware that secret deals had been signed. Duan Qirui, the premier of China after Yuan Shikai died in 1916, had made a secret deal with Japan in order to secure loans to build up his Anhui clique's army. The infamous Nishihara loans were given to Duan Qirui, and in return, he signed the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement that handed the Jiaozhou Bay lease over to Japan. On top of that, Britain had signed a secret agreement with Japan promising to support Japanese territorial claims in China if she joined the Entente war effort. The Chinese delegation were taken completely unaware and lost their case. Wellington Koo, leading the delegation effort, refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles in disgust. When the people of China found out about the situation at the Paris peace talks, they were outraged by their weak government and began boycotting Japanese goods. Intellectuals like Hu Shi, Chen Dishui, and Li Dazhao encouraged students towards political action. On May 4, 1919, the May 4th movement broke out as thousands of students took to the streets, protesting against the government. Soon, the working class began to support them as they called for the abandonment of traditional Confucian values in favor of a society based on science, democratic government, liberal individualism, and industry. Political and social ideas like liberalism, pragmatism, utilitarianism, anarchism, socialism, communism, and all the isms were being measured against China's traditional culture in an overall effort to truly become a modern state. It was another turning point in Chinese history. Some, like Hu Shi, called it the Chinese Renaissance. It ushered in enormous efforts to modernize China and led to the revitalization of the Kuomintang and birth of the Communist Party of China. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong participated in the movement, each drawing on it to support their own purposes. For both the KMT and CPC, the movement emphasized the need for China to modernize and catch up to the West. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong were both anti-imperialists, but Chiang was against the iconoclastic elements and tried to preserve Confucianism, as seen with his New Life movement in the 1930s. For Mao Zedong, he cautioned against forgetting one's history while also advocating for change. He argued that Communist China must still have Chinese characteristics. The beginning of CPC policymaking incorporated many aspects from the movement, such as women's rights, agrarian reform, democratic ideals, and nationalism. Indeed, the legacy of the CPC's emphasis on scientific innovation, economic development, and technological advancement drew strongly upon the May 4th movement. Additionally, the movement's emphasis on nationalism and social responsibility is at the core of the CPC's promotion of Chinese culture and social welfare. Of course, the CPC's interpretation of the May 4th movement is both heavily sanitized and selective. The CPC largely ignored or suppressed the more radical democratic elements and increasingly tightens control over civil society, media, and speech. In recent history, Xi Jinping has referenced the May 4th movement in speeches and writings, making it clear he sees it as a source of inspiration for his vision of China. He's argued that one of the key elements of the movement is the need for China to become strong and modern to resist foreign domination. Xi Jinping has called this his Chinese dream to make China a strong, prosperous, and modern nation by the middle of the 21st century. In many ways, Xi Jinping's interpretation of the May 4th movement is similar to Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, where all seek to modernize and fight against imperialism. Xi Jinping has emphasized and promoted the youthful and student elements of the May 4th movement, while simultaneously suppressing the June 4th movement. The Tiananmen Square protest of 1989 still to this day remains categorized as anti-CPC and anti-socialist. Thus, the current CPC government promotes one while condemning the other. The global powers quickly believed that the Boxer Protocol was far too humiliating. As a result, the United States enacted the Open Door policy, an attempt to prevent the further carving up of China by replacing such actions with universal trade and open access to Chinese markets for all. This was intended to weaken colonizing efforts, but by 1917 it contributed to the fracturing of China and her descent into the warlord era. From 1919 to 1929, foreign nations supported warlord cliques against one another, such as the Anhui, Zhili, Fentian, Kuomintang, and CPC. Warlords like Wu Peifu, Zheng Zuolin, Yan Xishan, Feng Yuxiang all fought to reunify China under their rule. Nations like Germany, Italy, France, Britain, America, and Japan funded clique armies, sent military advisors, and trained and even armed their men. This was all done to increase their nation's sphere of influence in China. Most notable was Japan's backing of the Tiger of Manchuria, Zheng Zuolin, at least until he began resisting their demands. The warlord era saw numerous wars, alliances, and betrayals. By 1926, after the death of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek took leadership of the Kuomintang and initiated the Northern Expedition. The Northern Expedition saw the KMT defeat isolated warlord armies in a gradual advance from southern China towards Beijing. As the KMT got closer to Beijing, Zheng Zuolin allied his Fengtian clique with the Zhili clique, forming the National Pacification Army. However, they were no match for Chiang Kai-shek's forces, and by 1928 had been pushed into Manchuria. Japan and her Kwantung Army grew dissatisfied with Zheng Zuolin, who was increasingly refusing their demands and military advice. In 1928, the Kwantung Army assassinated Zheng Zuolin by planting a bomb alongside a railroad bridge. The Heng Guntun incident, as it became known, was carried out with the expectation that a Japanese groomed replacement, Yang Yuting, who was a senior Fengtian general, would become Zhang Zuolin's successor. Instead, Zhang Zuolin's son, Zhang Shuiliang, took over the Fengtian clique. Enraged by his father's murder, he joined the KMT and helped reunify China under Chiang Kai-shek. After being pitted against itself, seeing numerous foreign powers, funding war after war, China was finally made nearly whole again. In the wake of this series of events, though, the Kwantung Army planted another bomb on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. The Mukden incident was a false flag operation, the brainchild of Lieutenant Colonel Ishiwara Kanji. The Empire of Japan used the incident to invade Manchuria and install the final emperor of the Qing Dynasty, Puyi, upon the throne of the new puppet state of Manchukuo. There was little Chiang Kai-shek's new nationalist government could do, however, as they were too militarily weak to resist the Japanese at the time. This began the Chinese War of Resistance, a 15-year struggle against the Empire of Japan. Keep in mind, Japan didn't stop with Manchuria. The January 28th incident of 1932 saw them invade Shanghai, forcing the region to demilitarize. In 1933, Japanese forces fought their way to the Great Wall, forcing China to sign the Tanggu Truce, effectively ceding control of Rehe province and forming a demilitarized zone between the Great Wall and the Beiping-Tianjin region. Japan then began collaborating with warlords from the North China Autonomous Movement, seizing influence over Shanxi, Hebei, Suiyuan, Shandong, and Chahar provinces. Japan was not alone in taking advantage of Chinese weakness. The Soviets also seized the opportunity to invade Xinjiang, taking nearly half of the region. In 1935, Japan seized Inner Mongolia and Hebei, and by the end of the year, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had essentially abandoned northern China. Greatly emboldened, Japan performed another false flag operation in 1937, known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. What began as sporadic skirmishing escalated into full-scale battle, seeing Japan invade Tianjin and Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek knew this was an existential threat and decided to finally act. He concentrated his elite German-trained divisions, including nearly all of his armor, and forced the Japanese to face them in full view of the international community in Shanghai. He hoped by making a grand show of force in front of the Western powers that they might intervene and aid China. It was a large gamble, one which saw Chiang Kai-shek lose nearly all of his elite forces, greatly crippling his nation's ability to further fight the Japanese. A byproduct of the Chinese war effort in Shanghai was the infamous Rape of Nanjing. As the Chinese forces retreated from Shanghai, they drew the IGA forces towards Nanjing, where over the course of 6 weeks, they carried out war crimes such as mass rape, looting, arson, and the murder of soldiers and civilians. The death toll is a contentious issue which continues to be debated to this day, with a low estimate of the number of people killed at around 40,000 and the high estimate at as many as 300,000. There were also an estimated 20 to 80,000 women raped during the massacre. Before the 1970s, Mao Zedong drew little attention to the very worst Japanese atrocities committed during the war in order to maintain trade relations with Japan. The Rape of Nanjing has been hailed as one of the worst war crimes in modern history, and it remains a cornerstone for anti-Japanese sentiment in China. The Western nations responded with embargoes on scrap iron, oil, and other war-related materials. The result was that between 1937 and 1941, Chiang Kai-shek and Japan were stuck in undeclared total war, neither side willing to formally declare it, as they both required foreign trade to continue to fight the war. Japan was stuck in what they referred to as the China problem, initiated their Nanshin-Ron strategy to solve it. This ushered in the Pacific War of 1941 to 1945. For Chiang Kai-shek, it was a moment of salvation, however, as China now had allies against Japan. Yet the early part of the war saw Japan winning nearly every battle, expanding to a colossal size, stretching across more of Asia and the Pacific. While Japan expanded, so did her war crimes against the numerous populations she faced, most notably the Chinese. Massacres occurred across China, including the Qiangjiao massacre and the Panjiayu massacre, part of the Sanko-Sakusen, or Three Alls policy, implemented between 1942 and 1945. The Three Alls, kill all, burn all, loot all, was a scorched earth policy enacted in northeast China as a reprisal for the 8th Route armies, 100 Regiments Offensive. It claimed nearly 3 million Chinese civilian lives and was sanctioned by Emperor Hirohito. Alongside the massacre came horrifying human experimentation by IGA research units like the notorious Unit 731. Units like 731 performed biological and chemical warfare research and development in secrecy. They performed war crimes on human beings, many of whom were Chinese. Experiments could include disease injection, dehydration testing, biological weapons testing, live vivisection without anesthetics, organ harvesting, amputation, frostbite testing, rape, and sexually transmitted disease testing, amongst other horrors. Unit 731 produced the biological and chemical weapons used against Chinese populations, notoriously during the Zhejiang, Jiangxi campaigns, claiming an estimated 200,000 civilian lives. They released plague, typhoid, paratyphoid, cholera, smallpox, botulism, anthrax, and other horrors through various means like contaminated fleas, animals, well poisoning, food poisoning, and so forth. Many of the scientists who worked for these units were later granted immunity by the United States through programs similar to Operation Paperclip. During the war, China suffered up to 35 million deaths, most of them civilian. While Japanese government officials and Emperor Hirohito acknowledged Japanese atrocities committed against the Chinese, the Japanese government considers the legal and moral position towards war crimes to be separate from each other. Therefore, Japan maintains she did not violate international laws or treaties, but recognizes the suffering her military caused and had made numerous apologies stating to this effect. These apologies, however, have been deemed inadequate or merely symbolic by China. There have been numerous scandals surrounding this, even recently, including former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who in 2007 denied Japan using comfort women during the Second World War, stating, "The fact is, there is no evidence to prove there was coercion." This was met with wide-scale outrage across Asia. While not taking legal responsibility for comfort women, an Asian Women's Fund was created in 1995, giving money to those forced into prostitution during the war. Now, as you can imagine, the legacy of the Chinese War of Resistance against Japanese aggression heavily influenced Cold War China. Historian Rana Mitter has written extensively on the history of China during her war with Japan and has regarded China as a forgotten ally. This is accurate, as China was not considered an equal partner by her allies during the war. Chiang Kai-shek was continuously sidelined by his allies. Despite the unequal treaties being lifted from China, exploitation was certainly still occurring. Immediately after the war, the Soviet Union supported the CPC while America supported the KMT during the Civil War. By 1949, the CPC had emerged victorious, and Mao Zedong made an opening address at the first plenary session of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. "Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up." Mao Zedong declared the Century of Humiliation was over, but the memory of the humiliation would endure. Indeed, the fresh and harrowing experiences of the Second World War and the Century of Humiliation heavily influenced Chinese foreign affairs. With the war so fresh in the minds of the Chinese people, Mao Zedong began his tenure by isolating China diplomatically and launching grand projects like the Great Leap Forward. Meanwhile, the Republic of China, Taiwan, was recognized by the new United Nations, while the People's Republic was not. For the PRC, this further reinforced the narrative of the Century of Humiliation that the international order could not be trusted. The PRC sought recognition at the UN, but the United States made concerted efforts to thwart this, earning more distrust from China. Amid the Sino-Soviet split and the American war in Vietnam, President Nixon entered into negotiations with Mao Zedong, finally normalizing US-PRC relations and earning the PRC recognition at the UN. Yet, because of the Century of Humiliation, to this day China holds a deep-seated suspicion of Western intentions. The CPC persistently portrays China as an innocent victim of Western nations' continued determination to subjugate China. In 2005, Pen Guanqiang and Yao Yuji wrote in Science of Military Strategy, quote, "Western nations are fundamentally rapacious, greedy, and aggressive, having grown historically out of slave states that frequently launched wars of conquest and pillage to expand their territories, plunder wealth, and extend their sphere of influence." Chinese leaders continue the narrative, arguing the international system was and is currently Western-centric and thus not to be trusted. From the onset, the CPC followed the Soviet stance on only recognizing treaties and customs as sources of international law and avoiding judicial proceedings on an international level. At the UN in 1982, China did not consign jurisdiction in the international law of the sea, arguing it was contrary to its idea of state sovereignty. It would take 2 decades after the Century of Humiliation for China to become a true international player. Ever since 1949, China has become obsessed with avoiding any chance of embarrassment at the hands of the West or Japan. The Century of Humiliation can be summarized as the suffering of 3 kinds of loss: a loss of territory, a loss of control internally and externally, and a loss of international standing or dignity. Each loss since 1949 has remained a principal aim for the PRC to overcome. During the Century of Humiliation, China lost 1/3 of her territory, a process that colloquially became known as guafen, or being carved up like a melon. During the Cold War, the PRC quickly reasserted its control over Tibet and Xinjiang, but it took 156 years to reclaim Hong Kong for Britain in 1997. Macau followed in similar fashion in 1999, but Taiwan looms as the last major loss. Taiwan has been considered a non-negotiable policy, a sacred duty of all the Chinese people. More recently, the PRC's 2005 anti-secession law made it clear that China is prepared and willing to use force to compel reunification if it does not occur peacefully. Xi Jinping recently called for a Chinese rejuvenation with the Zhongguo Meng Chinese Dream. Xi Jinping's Chinese Dream objectives were to double per capita GDP from 2010 to 2020, for China's military to be capable of fighting and winning wars, and to meet the social welfare needs of the people. Xi Jinping's regime has also highlighted the necessity for China to reassert herself as a maritime power. Today, China's main strategy problems are maritime in nature: Taiwan, her economic interests on the East Coast, territorial disputes in the East China Sea and South China Sea. All of these have drawn her into conflict with America's naval supremacy over the Pacific. China based her territorial security on 2 principles: reunify China and prevent foreign incursions. Chinese military leaders believed that neglecting naval forces in the past had led to much of the humiliation. Thus, until China feels she has regained what was lost, she will never feel whole again. What proves to be a more difficult task for China is regaining control over her internal and external environment and improving her international standing. Internally, each regime from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping has tackled the issue of corruption. It should be noted that corruption in the post-1949 period refers to the abuse of political power for private ends, typically by members of the CPC. Corruption has plagued the PRC in all aspects of administration, such as healthcare, education, law enforcement, and so forth. The emergence of private sectors inside the state economy, post-Mao Zedong's regime, saw a massive amount of CPC officials misusing their posts. Many officials propelled their relatives to profitable positions within the government, seeing the CPC become labeled Taizidang, or princelings. Relatives of former Premier Wen Jiabao, Chongqing Party Secretary Bo Xilai, and even General Secretary Xi Jinping have fallen under this type of scrutiny. Protests against such corruption contributed to the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Corruption in the PRC takes the form of embezzlement, bribery, extortion, misappropriated funding, and so forth. Since the 2000s, research has shown bribery went up exponentially, while embezzlement and misuse of public funds has declined. As technological advances increased, so did more sophisticated ways of bribery. This has led the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and National Audit Office to call for better legal structures and greater supervision over the business dealings of CPC officials and their relatives. Recently, Xi Jinping and the son-in-law of former Premier Wen Jiabao were caught using offshore financial havens to avoid taxes. As for the external world, Chinese intellectuals are quite divided on the matter. Some believe China can work within the current international system to improve their situation, while others seek to avoid or transform the current international system. While the PRC has emerged a major world power, the US is still viewed as the strongest nation in the world. Chinese leaders assert Western powers, particularly the US, will continue to assert their dominance in an international system they created. Many question whether China will become capable of altering the current system. The legacy of the Century of Humiliation has led to 2 schools of thought. The first is that the current system is unequal towards China, thus her participation should be kept cautious and minimal. The second is that China should grow her influence to adapt to the existing system. As for the restoration of China's dignity, it remains in the attempts to decolonize China. Numerous cultural objects were taken from China during the Century of Humiliation and remain in foreign museums. This has led to the establishment of the China Foundation for the Development of Social Culture in 2002, specifically taking action to regain stolen objects from the period of 1840 to 1949. According to the Chinese Society of Cultural Relics, the number of stolen objects could be in the millions of pieces, scattered across at least 47 countries and collected by over 200 foreign museums. Museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Musée Guimet, and of course the British Museum are known culprits. From 1949 to 2016, at least 53 cases were recorded regarding the recovery and repatriation of Chinese cultural objects from abroad. China has employed numerous methods such as transnational civil litigation, negotiations, and international law enforcement to accomplish this goal. Particular importance is placed on items stolen from the Old Summer Palace that was looted by the British and the French during the Second Opium War. The burning and looting of the Old Summer Palace holds symbolism for the Chinese, that of colonialism and invasion wars. Now, China has largely achieved an adequate level of respect from the international system, or is at least getting close to doing so, thus restoring its perceived lost dignity. After the Beijing Olympics of 2008, Hong Liang wrote a piece for the China Daily titled "Time to Drop the Baggage of History," whereupon he stated, quote, "Having realized the dream of the century, perhaps it is time to relegate the Century of Humiliation to history, where it belongs. The glow of the Games should have dispelled any lingering bitterness from the humiliating defeats of China suffered at the hands of imperialist aggressors in the past century." Such remarks tend to argue China's growing standing has brought it closer to the equality it has desired, and that China should interact with the world free from fear or subjugation. Today, many Chinese leaders argue the US is still stuck in a Cold War mentality, that the international competition between them makes it impossible to establish a cooperation or a lasting global peace. In 2009, the PRC ambassador to Britain, Fu Ying, stated, quote, "China will never be a country that enjoyed war. The essence of Chinese culture opposes aggression and hegemony. The Chinese people were victims of aggression and bullying and will never agree to make their own country one of hegemony." Regardless, it is unanimous the PRC has emerged as a global power who refuses to be bullied ever again. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, who at this point really is in the midst of its own Century of Humiliation based on everything we do to it. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.